welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Jo Olson, and I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at Fresh Energy, and today we're sharing a recording from our March 23rd webinar discussing how distributed energy solutions can help meet growing electricity demand while also creating opportunities to strengthen workforce and supplier diversity. Let's dive in.
Beautiful day here in Minnesota. I'm not sure where all of you are, but I hope it's a beautiful day wherever you are. We're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Shubha Harris. I am the Chief Equity Policy Officer at Fresh Energy. For those of you who are not familiar with Fresh Energy, we are a Minnesota-based nonprofit that is working towards a clean and equitable energy transition. Before we dive in, I just have a few housekeeping items. The first is this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to all of those who registered after the event. The second is that we will be leaving some time for Q&A at the end. We've got a great panel, so I'm sure there will be questions. You can use the Q&A feature to pop your questions in there, and we'll try to monitor that throughout. And then this isn't really housekeeping, but definitely something I wanted to mention. One of Fresh Energy's guiding principles is to broaden participation in the energy transition. We're really trying to bring more people into the energy sector, into the clean energy transition. And so we're really trying to work hard to make our language accessible and easy to understand. So I'm going to ask my panelists today to do their best to take what can be a very technical and jargon-heavy subject. And I know I'm guilty of using 4 acronyms in a sentence, but I'm really going to try hard to use easy to understand language. So, and with that, I'll kick it off for some intros. I'm here joined today with Tim, Will, and Mark, a great panel. Let's do a quick round robin of intros, starting with you, Tim.
All right, it's nice to meet everyone. Tim Hade. I've been working in distributed energy for about 15 years. I started a cogeneration company, and then in 2015 started a company called Scale Microgrids, which builds predominantly behind the meter microgrids for commercial and industrial customers. I'm sort of fascinated with all things distributed energy, so looking forward to today's conversation. I think what y'all are doing in Minnesota is incredible, and I'm watching really closely and excited to be a part of this.
Great. Let's kick it over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Shubha. Hello, everyone. Mark Sebree with Sebree Consulting. We create and run Main Street small business and supplier diversity programs, also help corporate programming as well. I've spent 27 years in the utility industry for a Midwest utility where I won't use the acronym DSM, but I'll say demand side services or just demand side management. We ran programs such as rebate programs, small business programs as well, load management, weatherization. So I was in that for about 27 years altogether. Created and implemented award-winning supplier diversity programs as well. And then my last stint there was in economic development. And so back in 2014, I started Sebree Consulting, which my wife has run that. And I appreciate Lisa. She's on today as well. Shout out to her. And then concurrently, I went to work for Franklin Energy about 8 years ago as the director of diverse sourcing and inclusion. So I had their supplier diversity and the internal diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative as well. So I just retired in January. So now I'm back in Sebree Consulting, and I'm looking forward to talking with everyone today.
Well, that's great. Congratulations on your retirement, Mark.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take it over to you, Will.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Will Mulhern. I'm the director of our electricity program at Fresh Energy, and I handle our work at the Public Utilities Commission, often referred to as the PUC. I'm sure I will slip into that acronym a few times today. Been with Fresh Energy since late 2024, and prior to that, I was on staff at the Oregon Public Utilities Commission. So I've been in the regulated space a little bit, not as long as the 2 other folks on this call. I'm really excited to speak with both of them and kind of bring some Minnesota-specific context to this. So excited to be here today.
Great. Thanks, Will. It's great to have you all together. I'm going to start us off with some context. Before I came over to Fresh Energy, I was a regulatory attorney at Xcel Energy here in Minnesota. I started at Excel in 2020, and when I started there was still talk in the industry about the utility death spiral. That's the idea that electricity demand had been relatively flat for several years, and that energy efficiency and distributed resources like rooftop solar could potentially erode the utility business model. Well, fast forward just 6 years, and the picture looks very different today. We're seeing rapid growth in the industry. Electricity demand is growing. Some are even describing this sector as a new industrial era. So I'm going to start with you, Will. Could you ground us in some context? Tell us a little bit about the history. Tell us about the past electricity demand and where we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to talk about that. And as you said, it's a great time to be working in the energy space. Definitely a lot different than I think it would have been, or it was, 10 to 15 years ago. And really sort of at this inflection point, as you mentioned, sort of like this industrial revolution where there's a lot of money being put into the space because we're trying to do a lot of ambitious things with decarbonization, with load growth, and with other kind of novel solutions that we're bringing to the table. And so, I'll just say it's a great time to be working in energy, and excited to be part of these types of conversations. So really, the change that's driving that has been kind of these recent increases in demand projections, right? And so folks, I'm sure everyone on this call is very familiar with AI and data centers kind of driving a lot of that load growth. And that's certainly a huge part of it. And that's something that we're seeing in Minnesota. But there's a lot of other reasons for that as well, right? So we're trying to electrify a lot of end uses to meet our decarbonization goals, trying to electrify things like heavy industry, like vehicles, manufacturing. And a lot of that is driving load growth outside of AI. So across the board, there's a lot of pressure on utilities, on the energy sector to meet this demand so that we can, push our economy forward into a more decarbonized space. And so that's sort of the impetus for tackling these challenges and thinking about solutions of how we might meet that load growth. And that's a lot different than what was happening, really since the turn of the century, kind of like really stagnant, kind of consistent, small amounts of load growth, but nothing like what we're now seeing being projected. And so that's where we kind of need to think in ways that allow us to bring novel solutions to the table to meet that. Kind of the focus today is around distributed energy resources, and we'll certainly get into a lot of that, but you can think of a number of solutions that we could bring to try and deal with that. Just, I guess, talking just a little bit about Minnesota specifically, we're dealing with the same challenges that we see across the board, right? There's several data centers that are looking to come to Minnesota. It's a great economic development opportunity, but it's not without its challenges. And so those are things we want to address really head on and make sure that we're doing it in a way that works for our state. And Minnesota also is well positioned for other industries as well, right? So we have a big mining sector here, a lot of movement around electrification and mining, which is a really cool opportunity. And then kind of downstream of that, thinking about steel production and how we can do that in a decarbonized way. A lot of electricity involved in that too. So great opportunities for Minnesota to really lead on this. And we're very much kind of at the forefront of this load growth that's happening. And Fresh Energy sees that kind of through the integrated resource planning process, which is where we're very involved with utilities and making resource decisions that can meet the need for this load growth without bringing additional fossil fuels on the grid. And maybe I'll just close with, I think, we're going to talk a bit about the Capacity Connect program that Excel is proposing. That came out of an IRP, right? So that came out of Excel looking for solutions to meet some of this load growth and to meet their needs in sort of I guess you could call it a non-traditional way, a way that doesn't involve adding more fossil resources on the grid. And that's a program we're really excited about. I think that's a great use case of how distributed energy resources can be leveraged to help meet this kind of moment. And yeah, excited to talk more about that and get into that a little bit. But that's kind of broadly from my perspective, what we're seeing in Minnesota and across the board in terms of the moment in electricity right now.
Great. Thank you for that context. As you said, we're here to talk about distributed energy resources. And Tim, I know you've been pounding the pavement for over a decade trying to raise visibility about what DERs are and what value they can bring to the grid. So maybe you can just start by telling us what they are and what they can do for us.
Yeah, for sure. So I think basically, if you want to understand distributed energy resources, the short, simple, definition of this is just customer-sited resources that add value to the grid. And so to kind of give everyone like a very quick 2-minute history of how this evolved, right? The electric grid was commercialized really in the first part of the 20th century. And up until the 1970s, it was like a one-way street, right? And so we have to load balance demand and supply. But the way that was done was just by changing supply, right? So modulating supply up and down. And it was like that all the way up through the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had an energy crisis. And during the energy crisis, one of the things that we came up with was the idea of a very basic form of demand response, which is grid operators, when the grid got stressed, would call large loads like factories and tell them to send everyone home. And they would shut down the factory. They would send everyone home. They would get paid for taking capacity off the grid. And on a net basis, that helped us manage energy costs through the energy crisis of the 1970s. And then we kind of didn't really do anything with it until the early 2000s. We had some of those programs in place, but it wasn't prolific. And then in the 2000s, we had another energy crisis in the state of California, where I currently reside. And the difference is this time in the energy crisis, we had the internet, right? And so sort of version 2 of demand response was, okay, now we have the internet. And instead of making physical phone calls or, phone calls to people and telling them to shut off, everything and go home, we can now have, sort of connected devices, and we can send signals, and we could do this in a slightly better way. So sort of another evolution happened in, sort of the 2000 to 2005 timeframe, with sort of demand response version 2. And then, Shubha, as you mentioned, right, I think over the last, 10 or 15 years, technological progress has been remarkable, right? Generally referred to as like the Internet of Things. And so now you're in a situation where basically everything you own is controllable and connected to the internet, whether that's your refrigerator, your thermostat, your hot water heater, your heat pump, whatever the case might be. But because demand was flat, we didn't really have the economic signals to take advantage of that. And so now we're kind of in like energy crisis number 3, right? Which is, we have way more demand than we have supply. And we have to try to start thinking about, okay, how do we improve grid utilization, and how do we make the system overall more efficient, so we can not only connect a lot more demand to the grid, which is good for, economic prosperity, but we can also do so in a way that doesn't increase rates for, people who are paying their electricity bills every day. And so this we're now kind of in like the third wave of distributed energy or demand response in terms of the evolution. And the question now is, we have all these, IoT enabled devices. We have all these technologies like, cheap solar panels and affordable batteries and all sorts of things in our toolkit. How do we use those things to increase grid utilization and make a better system for everyone? And again, I think one of the reasons I'm here today, and I'm really excited to talk to, the Minnesota constituents here, is I think Minnesota is really leading on this front, especially when it comes to, public-private partnerships and, the utility's central role in sort of rolling these things out on the grid. And so I think you guys are doing a great job in Minnesota, and excited to talk more about it.
That's great. Can you say a little bit more about the Minnesota model and what we're rolling out here? Or,
so
hopefully.
Yeah, sure. Right. So, all right, I guess like to be blunt about this, right? For the last like 15 years, as long as I've been doing this, there has been what can best be described as an adversarial relationship between people who do what I do, like demand response and distributed energy, and utilities, right? And I think, again, the fundamental reason for that was kind of rooted in economic incentives, which is, my argument to utilities was always like, hey, there's like a cheaper, better, more efficient way to provide power to people. And the utilities response was kind of like, yeah, but load's not going up and we're good, right? Like we have a good thing going. And again, right, I think there was a lot of credence to that point. And so again, I think what has traditionally happened is we haven't really had like a close partnership with utilities. We've kind of been going around as an industry, like picking off homeowners and businesses one at a time. And it hasn't gotten big enough that it's really been a threat to utilities. Although like we kind of got to the point to, as you mentioned, and I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, where I think utilities were starting to realize like the technology was getting good enough that it could potentially be a threat if there wasn't load growth. Now we don't have any of those problems, right? Because we have more load growth than we know what to do with. And so the question now is, how does the distributed energy industry and utilities work together? And I think one of the best examples of this is what Excel is doing in, the Minneapolis, greater Minneapolis region. And the idea here is basically the best way to deploy distributed energy resources is in concert with the utility, right? And so if you can work with the utility to manage distributed resources on the distribution grid, then sort of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And there's a really, really interesting program that Excel is running. They've partnered with a company called Spark Fund, and they're deploying a network of distributed batteries around the city of Minneapolis, which will ultimately help improve grid utilization and reduce rates for ratepayers. It's kind of a first of a kind program, right? So we don't know exactly how it's going to go yet, but I'm really excited to see what happens, right? And I think there could be a case, and maybe will be a case in a year and a half, 2 years, where Minneapolis has the best electric grid of any major city in the United States. And so, we got a lot of work to do between now and then, but I think, that's the really interesting experiment you all are running. And I think it's, the right way to do this.
That's great. Thanks for telling us about the program. So I know we talked a little bit about the utility owned. So the utility here in the Spark Fund partnership is going to own the batteries. I understand that there are other models for how we can meet these distributed or these large load additions. So maybe if you want to talk about that a little bit, or Will, happy to have you both jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I can start, and then, Will or Mark, feel free to interrupt me. I mean, look, I think there are a lot of different business models with respect to how to do this, right? I think the thing that ultimately matters is it has to be done in concert with the utility, right? So what you don't want is like a bunch of people like me just running around putting batteries wherever we feel like it, right? Because that doesn't result in the best possible system. And so ultimately, what we have to figure out how to do is we have to figure out how, for the utilities to signal the distributed energy industry with respect to where they want batteries, how big those batteries should be, not just batteries, but sort of all forms of distributed energy. Where do you site it? How big should it be? What should the operational characteristics be? What are the technical requirements to be able to do that? And there are a few different business models that you can use to figure that out. How it's done in most of the rest of the country is, I don't know, pretty bad, right? And so we have these things called hosting capacity maps, which will show, people like me where there's excess capacity on the grid, but there's a lot of privacy concerns and issues around updating the hosting capacity maps in real time. And so a lot of times I'm looking at a map from 6 months ago, and then I go to do my project, I file an interconnection agreement, and the utility's like, sorry, we made some changes, right? And so it's always been this kind of like fragmented, imperfect sort of working process where I don't have full transparency on information. The utility doesn't have full transparency on information. And the result of that is kind of, I don't know, feelings get hurt, right? And people don't necessarily, it's not like a great way to work together. And so, I think what's happening in Excel is they're saying, well, okay, what if we own the resources, right? And we run a competitive process to find the best people to, build, own, and install these resources. And then we manage them on our distribution grid. That way we can tell those developers exactly where we want to put these assets, exactly how big we want them to be. And then we can bear the operational responsibility for running those and making sure they, contribute to the grid. And that's the first time, this has really been done at this scale. And so again, right, like in a classroom, it's the economic optimal, right? Because you have like incentives perfectly aligned between the utility and the distributed energy project. But we've never done it in practice, right? And so we're going to do this over the next year or two. We're going to see what happens. And again, I'm sure it's not going to be perfect, but hopefully there will be a lot of lessons learned and we can roll this model out in other areas around the country.
One of the really exciting parts about this project is the competitive procurement aspect, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but I want to just turn to you, Will, and let you talk about what other models that you're seeing out there, what works, what are you excited about?
Yeah, for sure. No, I think Tim set that up really well. And I would say, as we talk about kind of the first time, definitely in Minnesota, that we have a utility that's leveraging its distribution system to do these types of distributed resources, you can then start to think about what that enables down the road, right? So this is very much the first time we've seen it. But as we get the use cases established, as we start to understand, okay, there's value here, it can be operated in this way to deliver this value, then you start to think about what the next steps are. And it's like, then you can get into a space where customer-owned resources might become, a good model. There might be a way to make that work really well if you're targeting resources in a specific place with a specific use case, and you have the utility aggregating those and operating those in a specific way. So I think what's really exciting for us is this is the first step toward a more distributed grid and toward starting to think about the different ways that we can leverage these things that we really haven't done in the past, or that utilities really haven't done in the past, to try to drive these things forward. And it can happen in a relatively quick fashion, right? Like once you get to a more realized state of operating this, it becomes a lot easier to bring things onto the grid. A lot of these, whether it's customers, like their batteries, like a power wall at home or an EV or whatever it may be, like things are already connected to the grid and operating. And so once you start to understand how those can be managed and how it can be kind of pulled together to deliver value, I think things can start to happen really quick. And what we see in the planning side of things, like when we're engaged in a utilities planning process, is they need to bring things online quickly. We talked a lot about load growth, setting this up, and as data centers come online, they want power and they want it fast. And so when you have things that are already connected to the grid, and the utility begins to understand how it can operate those in a beneficial way, I think that's another exciting aspect of it too. And then, I know we're kind of turning to the supplier diversity piece after this too, but we're talking about all this money that's being spent and these things that are being built and investments being made. And I think that also creates a really cool opportunity to think about how that creates economic opportunity throughout the state, throughout the service territory. So there's lots of different models for it. I think what we're just really excited about is that it's happening, right? Like we very much believe in kind of an all of the above approach to this stuff. And so seeing Excel kind of take the first swing at this is something that's really excited us on the fresh energy side.
Great, thanks. I think that's maybe a good segue to shift gears over to the supplier diversity topic. Mark, I'm going to ask you. So many of us are familiar with workforce diversity, but some not as familiar with supplier diversity. So for those of us that are less familiar with supplier diversity, can you just kind of tell us what it is and how it's different from workforce diversity?
Yeah, so I'll just make the statement that, supplier diversity and workforce diversity are inclusion programs. They're different. They're related but different. So if you think about supplier diversity, it's a business imperative. It's an internal process that really helps to push a business strategy forward that includes a wide array of different types of businesses, whether it's minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, disabled-owned businesses. It really sets a platform that all these different types of business owners can participate, and it really enhances the competitiveness of a program, of a supply chain, and it fosters innovation. It really, I think, work towards supply chain sustainability. So you can really characterize this as sort of an external facing initiative within a corporation, within the supply chain organization. If you think about workforce diversity or employee inclusion, that's more of an internal facing. So that's where you're really you're working with HR or people and culture, whatever that organization called. You're working with them to make sure that everyone feels included within the company and valued. And if people feel included and valued, that's also going to increase productivity. The studies are in, they've been done, they study this thing to death. And we know that if employees are happy, you're going to get a better product. It's just going to be better for everyone. So that's where employee inclusion is so important. And when I say inclusion, I want to make this statement. I make this statement whenever I talk about this, that includes everyone. And sometimes white males may feel excluded. This is including everyone. We need everyone in this process. So that's kind of the difference between the internal employee inclusion and external supplier diversity. Again, it includes everyone. So there's things such as employee resource groups that are put together to help employees on the internal facing aspect to feel valued within a company. So these, again, they're not nice to haves. These are now business imperatives. We need everyone. I'll use the phrase later. We need all hands on deck in these types of initiatives.
Great. I appreciate the distinction between the two. We're here to kind of talk a little bit more about supplier diversity. I know that's your sort of forte. The Minnesota utilities annually report their supplier diversity numbers, which include veteran-owned, women-owned, businesses owned by people of color. And the general numbers that the Minnesota Utilities reporting right now are all sort of around the 5% or lower number. Can you just kind of tell us, give us some context, what is considered a strong or meaningful benchmark when it comes to supplier diversity?
So yeah, so that's a great question. Spend dollars, spend percentages, that certainly is a good measurement. It's not the only measurement, but often the question is asked, what is a good number? That depends. It depends on the type of project that's being put forth. It depends on the demographics. If you look at census data, that's going to tie into, what can be expected as far as spend data. But not just the amount of spend or the percentage, but also what types of projects. Or do we have companies, small and diverse businesses who are just doing the basics, or do we have companies also participating in some of the more I would say complex spend and projects that we see that we're talking about right here. So I think, single digits, I feel that there could be improvement to that, because if you compare that to the demographics, particularly to Minneapolis, I believe what I last saw, there seems to be about a 40-50% demographic. I could be wrong on that, so don't quote me on that. But that tells me that, single digits, there could be improvement there. But if you look at other parts of the state or other states, that, there could be a reason for that. So I think looking at spend is one thing for a KPI, but also looking at how well does the business perform? Those are always important measures, just like we would for any non-diverse business or non-small business as well. So there's a lot of things that can be measured, and that's what we look at when we put these programs together.
I was surprised when I was preparing for this webinar, the demographic difference in population between Minneapolis and Minnesota. The demographics of Minneapolis and the racial demographics of people of color are much higher in Minneapolis. So 40 to 50%, I think, is what you had said. But statewide, I think people of color approximately 20%. So I know a lot of the project will be in Minneapolis, but there will be some outstate work that's done by the Excel and Spark Fund. And so what you're kind of generally saying is sort of tracking the racial demographics of the locale, both at the granular level, but also at the statewide level, is kind of what we should be shooting for.
Yeah, and that's a practice. When I was at Franklin Energy, we worked all across the country, and we were asked, well, what are your supplier diversity goals? And again, my answer is always, well, we look at the state or the region that we're working in, and what are the demographics there. So yeah, I think that would apply here as well. And so that's why it's important to make these relationships locally in Minneapolis to the different community organizations and workforce development organizations, and the list goes on. And we've already identified a lot of those, but it's important to really get close to these organizations so that we can find out where that potential is. And I think we'll probably talk a little later about how much, these projects we're looking at like $1.4 trillion of spend that's potentially going to be coming up. And I think that's low. I usually, if I see a budget that, there's always going to be overrun. So if you look at you put all the small and diverse businesses together, and these businesses are not just bidding on utility programs, they're bidding on projects like across the spectrum, and whether it's infrastructure for our departments of transportation for states and that sort of federal levels, that sort of thing. If you put all that together, there's no way that there's capacity to handle all the work that's coming down the pipe. So that's why supplier diversity is so important, because it's bringing a new set of people into the to the table as well, and a new talent that we need to really support all these projects that are coming down the pipe.
So I know that you've been involved with several utilities in a mentoring or coaching relationship to help take utilities from single-digit numbers to double-digit numbers. So could you talk a little bit about the how? How do you do that? How do we grow the supplier diversity base to the degree that that reflect positive benchmarks? Yeah,
so I think this takes me back to, I had a mentor that I worked for at the utility, and he always told me, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. Data is so important. So we need to know know what we're dealing with. So from the project standpoint, that's why scopes are so important, to know what exactly is it that we're working for, and do that on a timely basis. So when I do try to help some of my utility colleagues and mentor them, we talk about really learning and understanding what it is that the company's looking for, or the business unit's looking for. So learning that, and then on the other side, learning what capabilities are out there. So that's that partnering with the local and diverse suppliers, knowing what their capabilities are, so that we can match scope to capabilities. And if we need to divide scope to a certain extent, if we can, we do that as well. So it's really just being intentional about trying to bring others into the fold to, again, come out with a solution that's going to work for everyone.
So you had mentioned the being intentional. So can you talk a little bit more about kind of how does that work with utility? How do you work with the utilities to ensure that there is intentionality?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, looking back on one example, I can remember a utility that their safety supplies are going to go out to bid. This is kind of a, it was kind of a big deal for the utility, because it's like they felt if it's not broke, don't fix it. But what we found was there was a lot of money being spent. I call it rogue spend. Some may use that term, meaning that there was dollars going out the door that did not need to be spent. So what we did is we looked to find a supplier that was not just a safety supplier, but also a safety consultant that could come in to look to see what is it that we're spending money on, and how can we get this under control from a rogue spend standpoint. So this particular supplier, he came in, he was very prepared. He brought his KPIs to the table, which is kind of different, because usually we have to ask for all that. So I think when I try to help and coach others to say, have your suppliers come to the table prepared. So have them be prepared on, number one, what is the main thing that they do? Don't say they can do everything. What's the best thing? What's the thing they do best? Talk about how they measure their success, and then have them bring solutions to the table. So just one solution this particular supplier came to the table with, he looked at all the gloves that were being used in safety. And again, there were like a lot of SKUs of gloves being used. He came through and said, basically, well, you may have, and I'm making up numbers here, maybe you have 20 SKUs of gloves. I can get that down to 5. Now, what that means is initially he was going to be basically making less money with the utility, but over time, because it's growing as a partnership, that would increase the trust, and also increased his work within that utility. So that was done. And again, we saw that spend number, it started to go up, but with a value to it. He did the same thing with batteries. It's kind of interesting in the utility world. Around December, the use of batteries goes up exponentially. We couldn't figure out why. Well, the Christmas holiday was coming up. People were taking batteries home left and right. So what this supplier did was bring a solution. He says, well, what if we use vending machines, and we have each battery expenditure tied to an individual and tied to a business unit? This is value that this person brought to the table. So when I work with different utilities, I really talk about what value can they bring. And then, of course, that value gets recognized by all as a really a business imperative, but also helping the supply chain sustainability. Those are some of the tips that I help when I try to mentor others.
Sure. Sounds like there's a matchmaking component, and then just getting really specific, or getting that relationship built so that it can last. Tim, I know you work with utilities quite a lot. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what it's like to work with utilities on the DER side.
Yeah. Well, look, I think the first thing, just to sort of piggyback off what Mark was saying, is, look, like supplier diversity at this point in time is an imperative, because we need to grow the pie of people who know how to do this work, right? And so if you think about, I don't know, every day in the newspaper, you read about how like we're running out of electricity. The bottleneck is not turbines or transformers or switchgear. The bottleneck is people, right? So if you go look at all the data, like the problem is there are not enough EPCs who know how to do this work in order to get all this work done. And then once we solve that, then there are also turbine and transformer and switchgear supply chain issues. But like people is the number one thing. And so look, I mean, I think that's kind of changed the way that companies like mine think about working with utilities, right? Most of the companies that are in the DER space are startups, right? And if you're a company like mine, you're heavily populated with like engineers and energy nerds and people like that, but like not really well equipped to think about like, well, how do we grow the vendor workforce in the city of Minneapolis, right? That's not really something I know how to do. I know it has to be done, but I don't know how to do it. And so I think, that's kind of where, the partnership with utilities is heading, where it's like, hey, if you want to do this at 50, 100, 150 megawatt scale, we have to start thinking differently about how these how this relationship works. And again, right, I think it's pretty clear that like when you're trying to execute projects of that magnitude, utilities are uniquely positioned to think about those types of programs. And so again, I think how we've traditionally worked with utilities is let's just say it's kind of like a leadership void, right? Where like the utilities over here and we're over here, and there are programs, but there's not really a clear chain of command in terms of how any of this stuff works. And like, I have my legislators, and the utilities have their legislators, and typically they're better at that than I am, right? And so we kind of play that game. But again, right, it's really, really inefficient. And so I think, where the opportunity is, when utilities could take a leadership role and play in that coordination function, right? And they could say, okay, look, like we know that we have to deploy a bunch of distributed energy, but we're not just going to do it in like an ad hoc way. Like we have a plan and this is how we want to do it. Then you can start to think about, okay, like what else do we need to build around that in order to really make this work and make this work in, an optimal way. And so, that's really where I think, the workforce development and, the supplier diversity angle of this comes in, which is we have to do it, right? We have to have, more electricians. We have to have more developers. We have to have more procurement people, right? But, coordinating that on a regional basis is like a big undertaking, right? And there aren't a lot of 100-person companies out there that are equipped to do it. And so I think that's a huge role for the utility moving forward. And I think what you're going to see is in utility territories where the utility takes a leadership role in doing this, you're going to have better outcomes than when it's just kind of like, I don't know, the Wild West, right? And so, one of the interesting things to look at, over the next 10 years is, are these systems going to be better in Minneapolis or Austin, right? Because like in Texas, there are no rules, right? And it's just kind of like, go for it. And again, I think that means you move fast, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're building projects or, economies of scale that are going to last. And I think the way y'all are approaching it in, Minneapolis, potentially, turns out that that's the best way to do it. And not only do you get it done pretty quickly, but you also, have something that lasts and an ecosystem that can build upon itself. And so, again, I think that's why this is a really interesting experiment.
And I might.
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels in the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Will.
No, I was just going to say, if I could jump in and build on that a little bit, I think like another interesting part of this is whether it's like a new supplier, working within the supply chain of a utility or a data center or whoever it may be, or a DER company that's trying to, sell something to a utility or integrate into the grid. It's also this like very esoteric space that for a long time, nobody has cared much about, or except for people like us on this call who are like nerds, like in the weeds. And now it's getting all this publicity and it's like driving the economy. And every time you open any sort of like financial publication, there's talk about investment in data centers and what it means for utilities and what it means for generation companies. And so I also think there's sort of an impetus on the utility and to some extent on regulatory agencies to bring people into the fold and to understand how to break outside of this kind of like very niche industry that we've been in, to get diverse suppliers to understand the value proposition of what it means to work in the space, and to get folks who have typically thought of themselves as like a microgrid company that works outside the bounds of the distribution system, right? Like they're kind of doing their own thing, but think about ways to pull those together into like a broader effort to really push this forward and to meet the challenges we're facing. And I think that's, speaking to utility folks a little bit, like I think that's a role that they need to be playing in bringing people into this and understanding kind of those structural barriers that exist, whether it's even just like acronyms or understanding how a tariff works or how a utility is regulated. I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well when we kind of talk about that. So sort of another theme that we definitely see in Minnesota and I know is consistent across the country.
Yeah, I think that dovetails with what I was going to say right after Tim, is just I see a lot of parallels in the kind of working in the DER space with supplier diversity, in the sense that it's like you need leadership that understands the value, that is willing to say, bring visibility to the topic of, whether it's DERs or it's supplier diversity, to say this is really important. We need to work with the folks that understand how to do this so that we can build the right ecosystem, so that we can meet the demand of the trillions of dollars that's going to be spent over the next several decades. I think that kind of goes a little bit to the topic of the why is this important in terms of supplier diversity. Mark, can you just maybe tell us a little bit about what you see as the value proposition?
Yeah, again, I think it's just really bringing really fresh blood, so to speak, to the table, fresh ideas. As I mentioned before, these trillions of dollars, we need new ideas, new approaches. I I grew up in a Navy veteran household, right? So my pop, I heard probably twice a week, get a move on, or it's kind of like all hands on deck, or what's the other thing he used to say, get the lead out. We need that approach. Like we kind of need a sense of urgency around this, because I've been around this for about 30 years, and we were talking 30 years ago about workforce development and training people up, because at the time I was at the utility 20 years ago, I was average age 45, and we were like really alarmed that we don't have all the craft workers that's needed to do this work. Well, that hasn't changed. It's only gotten even worse now. And as I think Tim talked about earlier, we're now hair is on fire. So supplier diversity and workforce development and workforce inclusion, all of that these are all, I think, things that can bring solutions to the table, right? And so that's why within the supplier diversity arena, we have a lot of professionals that are very committed to doing this, and when we do work together through different industry groups, I'll just give a shout out to one, Edison Electric Institute. We come together and share best practices to do things like this. So I think it really is imperative now that we see that we need this more than ever. Back when I was doing demand side management, when Tim was talking earlier, it made me think about a data point. Tim mentioned the Internet of Things. When I started this was 2 years before the internet was even commercialized, so it didn't exist. And now look at the exponential change in technology and connectivity and everything we have. So that's just going to drive demand even more, demand for energy, but also demand for talent and business and all that sort of thing. So I think the time is right for us to really act and act really intentionally to get things done.
That's great. I'm just going to let my audience know that we're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes here. So please go ahead and pop your questions in the Q&A if you have questions. But Tim, I'm going to go back to you and Will for your respective fields. I want to talk a little bit about sort of what you see as the challenges and the barriers to achieving the mission of meeting the growing demand from the DER's perspective.
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges, right? I think that's one of the things that I don't know, is both interesting and terrifying about the moment that we find ourselves in. So look, right? I think like the 800-pound gorilla in this whole thing is the AI data centers, right? And part of the challenge we have as an industry is that like no one really knows how much compute we need. Right. And so like you go to San Francisco and you talk to some of these frontier model companies and they're like, we need 300 gigawatts of compute by 2030. And like at a PUE of 1.25, that's 400 gigawatts of power, which is like, I don't know, a third the size of the entire US electric grid. And that's one company and that's 4 years away. And that's probably not going to happen. Right. And then you go talk to other people and they're like, yeah, like I was doing this in the 1990s when people told me the email was going to be 15% of like global, electricity use, and it's not. And so like, we're going to figure out more efficient ways to do this. And so the uncertainty about what the future looks like is really challenging to think about, right? And so I think the first thing is, we have to have at some level, a national strategic plan for how we're going to think about this, right? Because I think what you have right now is you have a lot of people making very speculative bets about, what's going to happen. And that's driving a lot of capital allocation, and that's driving a lot of investment decisions. And I don't know if that's the optimal way to go about this, right? So trying to understand to some extent what the demand side actually looks like is really, really challenging. Then you get into, okay, well, what are we actually using AI compute for, right? And so right now there's training and there's inference. And when you talk to computer scientists, they say, like, for sure, we definitely need big 1 gigawatt training clusters to do model training. I don't really understand why, and I've been like digging into this for the last year, and I haven't gotten a great explanation yet. But if you assume that's the truth, right, and that we really need to build like 1 gigawatt data centers in order to handle this kind of stuff, I mean, we've never done that before, right? There's never been like one site on a distribution node or a transmission node that consumes 1 gigawatt of power at like a 95% load factor, right? And so the technical challenges about like how do you actually integrate that into the grid are really, really, really that's like the cutting edge, right? Like how do you actually do that? And then if you're a state like Minnesota and you also care about climate change and you want to lead on sustainability and you want to minimize local air pollution and all that kind of stuff, like adding a layer of complexity to that is like, how do you do that without building a gigawatt gas plant next to the data center, right? And so I think like we don't know, right? The answer is like we don't know how to do that, but we have a lot of really smart, innovative people in this country, and we have to figure out a way to get all those people working off the same sheet of music and collaborating to figure this stuff out. Because on the other side of the ocean, there's a country that has a different system for doing this, and they're dominating us from a power generation and electrical capacity standpoint. And as much as I'm uncertain about AI, I'm much more comfortable in a world where America wins AI than I am in a world where China wins AI. So the national security implications of that are like a real thing. And so again, I think like we're in uncharted territory here with the amount of load growth we're talking about. If you use sort of, I think what most people are talking about, which is 100 gigawatts of net new load by 2030, I don't know how to do that, right? That's like a big challenge. I know that distributed energy is going to be a piece of that, right? And probably the cheapest megawatt that exists on the grid is the megawatt that we're not currently using with the infrastructure we have. So if you assume like nationally we're running our transmission and distribution system at something like a 50% average load factor or 50% efficiency, can we get that to 70%? And if we could get that to 70%, okay, there's your 100 gigawatts of power. And now we've bought ourselves another 3, 4, 5 years to figure out whatever we're going to do in 2030 moving forward. But again, right, like that's talking about, okay, we're going to build 100 gigawatts of load flexibility or distributed energy on the grid in the next 4 years. No one's ever thought about that before at that scale, right? And so, again, the only people I'm skeptical of that I talk to in like this industry are people who definitely know what's going to happen, because no one does. But I think, again, right, like the answer here is really collaboration. And I think that's where, utilities leading on this and then bringing the ecosystem and bringing the communities into the fold and sort of giving people clear rules of the road, I think is a really interesting framework for how to do it. And, could well end up being like the optimal way to do it after we try a few different things and see what works.
Yeah, and I would maybe add on to that. I agree with a lot of that very strongly. I think there's also, like the spectrum of risk and like how we respond to load growth, right? So like on the riskiest side, it's like we're going to build a bunch of behind the meter gas and nuclear plants, and then we're going to use that to meet this load growth. And then on the other side, it's like we're going to do the things we're talking about today, where we rethink how we use our grid, where we get better utilization out of the existing grid, where we minimize some of those additional capital investments, and where we just are smarter about how we use electricity. And it's like maybe the load growth doesn't materialize after we do all that, but that's a huge benefit regardless, that we've done the work to use the grid better. And that also enables a ton of stuff, whether it's clean manufacturing, whether it's mining or steel production, things we've talked about. And those are obviously a little Minnesota specific, but I think that just using this opportunity as a way to rethink how we use our electric grid is a pretty low risk thing to do. And so I think bringing all these folks into the fold, like bringing in the private capital, getting regulators on board with these types of ideas is like a really smart approach in any event. And people can disagree and certainly do on the use of AI and what the future of AI looks like. I don't know what it's going to look like. If I did, might not be on this webinar. I might be making millions of dollars for an investor somewhere, but I think that the truth is that there are steps we can take that are very low risk, that are very smart, and that can just move forward the state of our electricity grid. And I think that's a great opportunity there too.
Yeah, I think that's right. Mark, what do you think about from the supplier diversity standpoint, the challenges you're seeing?
Yeah, so one challenge is I think just getting into the game. So the barrier to entry. Sometimes that's a pretty high bar for a company starting out, or maybe a company that's been in business for some time, but not in this particular arena. So that's one. And so, but there are things that can be done, mentoring and partnerships and that sort of thing as well. Also, I think tapping into resources that we haven't tapped into before. And Tim kind of reminded me when he was speaking. I see his uniform there. Tapping into the veteran network. That's talent and also technologies that they're aware of that maybe many people are not aware of that could be used. And I know here locally, there's in the university have what's called a commercialization program where they actually take technologies that were created by the military and they're commercialize them onto the public sector. So I'm saying using collaboration and coordination to use all that to bring it to the table, because I really feel like we have not tapped into some of the resources that we could. And I think if we leverage all that, then we can come up with some really good solutions and quickly, not taking years to do this, because we don't have years to do.
Okay, Tim, I'm going to kick this one back to you. You had said we have to get this done. We don't know how we're going to do it. It's a very difficult challenge. So maybe could you lay out a couple of like what I call low-hanging fruit? Like what are some of the easier things that we could do? And then maybe spell out like if we could be a little more ambitious or accomplish all the things that we wanted to, what would those be?
Yeah, well, look, I think to oversimplify, right? The one sentence answer to what to do is put batteries everywhere, right? And so, when you look at all the research on this, right, we've actually built enough peak demand to be able to, or peak, supply to be able to handle a lot of what we have to build out on the grid. And that's not just AI, that's also advanced manufacturing, robotics, all the other things people want to build. But generally speaking, we have this problem where like 100 to 200 hours a year, we don't have enough capacity. And that's what really drives the need for additional generation, additional transmission and distribution resources. And so again, I think, the value that, batteries have today, and that can, traditionally be in the form of lithium ion or, LFP, which is, more of like a 2 to 4 hour short duration technology, or it could be all the way on the other end of the spectrum with Form Energy and what they're doing in Minnesota. So there's a lot of different kinds of storage, but the net being that if you can free up capacity during that 100 to 200 hours a year, then that's the number one thing that will get you through the next 4 or 5 years. And one of the big advantages of batteries, right, is that is one area where on a global basis, we don't have any supply chain constraints. So we actually, right, if I order a battery today, I can get it with a 16-week lead time. If I try to order a transformer today, I do not get a 16-week lead time. And so I think that's just kind of where the global economy is and sort of the supply demand, balance. And so we can deploy a lot of batteries really, really quickly. I think ultimately, like the perfect solution down the road, right, is generally what you would call like transactive two-way power flows, right? And so the idea that, the grid for 150 years now has been a one-way street, and what we really need it to be is a two-way street, right? We need to be able to, not only send electricity from the top down, but also the bottom up, and we need to figure out how to load balance. And, technically, we have the ability to do that. So, one of my favorite companies in the world is a company called Octopus Energy, which is, I think, now the most valuable company in the UK. But literally, when the Ukraine conflict happened 4 years ago, the UK went through this amazing transformation where they just started to do load flexibility everywhere. And as a net result, relative to their European counterparts, electricity rates have stayed low, performance has gone up. And that's really been enabled by technology really like computer-based technology that's helping to balance two-way power flows as opposed to one-way power flows. And you start to get into things like, oh, we can actually pay people to plug in their cars from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. and the amount of money they're making by plugging their electric vehicle into the charger during those times is offsetting their entire monthly lease payment, right? And you start to get into these like really interesting economic outcomes that can sort of help everyone go through this energy transition on a global basis, right? Because we're trying to do this in the US, but all this stuff has to happen globally. And so again, I think that's like kind of the longer term thing, but like point number one is just like put batteries everywhere, and then figuring out how to do that in the best way possible is a challenge. Which again, there's a few different experiments happening around the country, and you guys are leading one of them.
Yeah, that's great. Batteries, the value that batteries can provide to the system is really unlimited potential. Will, how about you on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with, largely a ton of what Tim said. And I think, that feels like a very straightforward, and that's kind of getting back to what I was talking about in terms of the low risk opportunities. Like, we know batteries work, we know how to use them in large part, and the technology is only getting better, whether it's in terms of how long it can discharge for, or the amount of material it uses, things like that. It's only moving forward. And again, I think it's just very low risk to plug in a bunch of batteries across the grid. And to be clear, I think that looks like utility owned batteries. I think that can be customer owned batteries. And I think there's tons of ways. And, we're not going to get into rate design at all in this webinar, but there's lots of questions about how you can design rates to make that work for the utility and for customers. And I think that's where you start to get to the frontier of some of these interesting questions. So maybe at a high level, I would say that rate design is a huge component of this, and an economic question that we're going to have to tackle. And unfortunately, not something we necessarily have time to get into today, but something that I think will be a core component of looking forward and transition.
Yeah, I agree. And when Tim was saying this is a national strategic conversation, the conversation around how do we do this so it's affordable for customers and customers can really benefit is a key to the conversation. All right, I think we're coming on to time. So Mark, I'm just going to end with you. What do you see as some low-hanging fruit? And then what do you see as the kind of the ideal scenario?
So I think low-hanging fruit right now is, get your supplier diversity or your supplier management engagement, whatever title that you're using, get those people in the room with your energy efficiency teams, start talking and figuring out, again, ways to collaborate and get that communication out. And then low-hanging fruit, I think looking at your current supply base, figure out who you have right now, if there's some development that can be done, and that's something that we can help with as well. Get those folks to the table, and so I think we get a head start. The more time before the project, the better. That way, we again can come up with a better outcome.
Great. Well, if anyone has any final last words, please go ahead. Anyone want to throw in something that was burning?
I'll maybe just close on, Fresh Energy. We do a lot of work in Minnesota, and it's very cool to have two experts from kind of nationally come together and support us on this. So very fortunate for this conversation, and also maybe want to underline that, like, kind of the impetus for this is we can do these cool things, we can make this investment in the future, and we can do that in a way that's going to sustain businesses and is going to build the economy across our state and across the country. And so I just appreciate having the opportunity to kind of have some back and forth with experts on those subjects.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say very quickly is perfect is the enemy of good, right? And so, look, I think any program that anyone in the state of Minnesota does, every project I've ever built, right, there's room for improvement. You're not going to get it perfect. There's going to be things that you wish you had done that you didn't do. What we need to do desperately right now is just do good projects. And one of the reasons I'm so excited for, the state of Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis is because I think, what's happening in Minneapolis is a good project, right? And we're going to learn a lot from it. It's going to help a lot of people. And it's going to help the rest of the people in the country watch this model and see how it evolves and, all that kind of stuff. And so I know there are criticisms and critiques. There are criticisms and critiques of every project that you can ever build. But this is a really, really good project. And thank you guys for the leadership.
Great. Well, we're at time, and I just want to also echo Will's comments. I really appreciate being on with such a great panel. Really excited to see how this project rolls out and continue the discussion on how we're meeting large load here in Minnesota and nationally. And it's just been great to be on with you all. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for subscribing to Decarbonize, the Clean Energy Podcast from Fresh Energy. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. And we just announced that Jesse Jenkins, nationally renowned energy researcher and analyst, will be the guest speaker at our 2026 Benefit Breakfast on October 8th. Registration is now open. In the meantime, you can support Fresh Energy's work to drive bold policy solutions to achieve equitable, carbon-neutral economies in Minnesota and beyond. Head over to our website for the latest news from Fresh Energy and make a donation today. Thank you to the band Palm Psalm for providing our theme song. It's called DGAF, and it's off of their album Ode to Haka. Get the latest from the band at palmpsalm.com.